Greetings, greetings, greetings. Hello, happy Sunday. And we sincerely hope all of you are maintaining your best physical, mental, and spiritual health that you possibly can at all times. We sincerely hope that you're able to do that. And we are so glad that you're able to join us for this discussion today, the effective strategy of coded racism. And we're going to talk about that history and how it's currently implemented and things we can do to address it. First, as always, never would start anything we do in the All African People's Revolutionary Party without this. We acknowledge and give respect to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. We're going to be talking about them in concrete terms during this presentation. So we always acknowledge that this is their land that we're on and that they must get their land back. Not just it's their land symbolically, but oh well, let's carry on and pretend like the US is some sort of legitimate thing. No, it's not. It's an illegitimate, immoral settler colony that must be replaced, and the indigenous people must get their land back. And we believe that 100%, and we are dedicated to contributing everything that we possibly can to support them in that endeavor of self-determination. And of course, we always equally give respect to our African ancestors who have fought and made it so that we could be here today. These people wearing these shirts and these memes talking about I'm not my grandparents, because their suggestion is that they would fight back against, they would retaliate against oppression, and somehow they're under this point of view that our ancestors did not do that. And I understand why they believe that, because their source of information has been our enemies. So your enemy is never going to educate you about the methods you utilize to overthrow oppression. So folks don't know that, and they buy this capitalist narrative that the civil rights movement was 100% nonviolent and turn the other cheek, and people could beat the hell out of us, and we just prayed. And a lot of you listening, that's your understanding of our history, because that's how it's presented. That's how it's presented in schools. That's how it's presented in this society. So, we know that that's not true. Our folks have always fought back. All oppressed people fight back. As Kwame Ture said, oppression always breeds resistance. So we know that's not true. And so we honor our ancestors for what they have always done to contribute to our forward liberation. And then I just want to, we talk a lot about the necessity for independent, revolutionary political education. We talk about that a lot every week. We talk about that in everything that the All African People's Revolutionary Party does. And I just wanted to give you just a quick example. Like, I was just reflecting on this before we started just now. This past week, in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we have committees and we have task forces. And these bodies and entities are designed to facilitate us doing the work that we do to achieve our Pan-Africanist objective. And so just this past week, over the last 7 days, I participate on our political education committee, which is an internal committee we have to facilitate ideological development through our work study circle process. So in our cadre circle process, we're reading Kwame Nkrumah's Challenge of the Congo. So that's been reading I've engaged in this week for that process. And then I'm a part of an anti-patriarchy task force that we have in the APRP, and we are reading a book on the history of gender binary in Africa, so that we can engage in seminars and political education efforts to educate our membership around this question that there have always been more than two genders in African history. And so I'm reading that. And then also on our political education committee, we had an international call this morning. Well, this morning for me, but there were people on there from various parts of Africa, Europe, throughout the Western world. And so we read this wonderful article about the history of women in the Cultural Revolution in China. So just this last week, and then on top of that, just on my own, I'm reading this book that just came out from Peniel Joseph on the contrast, the sword, the shield and the sword, the contrast between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And so, I just realized like this has been my life for as long as I've been an adult, right? Like this constant study and analysis, not just on an individual level, but on a collective level. And so I think that's very important because, if we had a percentage of our population, and I'm not saying it's easy because it's not, but if we had a percentage of our population engaged in that kind of collective ideological struggle, that's how we get to the types of things that we're talking about. So, with that, keeping that in mind, we'll get started. And as always, just a quick introduction. As I mentioned, 36 years, I've been an organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which is the party that facilitates this work, and all the work that I'm involved in comes from this perspective. It always has, and it always will. Even if I've worked with other organizations, it was always from this Pan-Africanist perspective. And then with me, I'm honored to have my outstanding daughter, Shakura, who is in another part of this settler colony, but participates every week in doing this with me, and so happy to do this with her. So honored. She has an outstanding activist work that she does herself. And so just honored to share this space with her every week, and looking forward to seeing her very shortly in person. So that's a wonderful thing. And again, if you didn't know, the objective of the All African People's Revolutionary Party is Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa, one unified socialist Africa. All of the organizations you see in the logos provided to you on the right, and others that are not here shown to you, have that same objective of one unified socialist Africa. And our work is around bringing all of these organizations together as one to achieve this objective, which we believe is the solution to the problems that African people face in over 100 countries worldwide, where we live in significant numbers. We believe that it is our contribution to the worldwide socialist movement leading to world communism. And we also believe that it's our contribution to humanity to support other struggles for justice that are being engaged as well. The struggle for indigenous rights here, Palestinian rights, Irish self-determination, Filipino self-determination, determination of women, people who are not men, all oppressed people on the earth. We believe our struggle for Pan-Africanism is our, as African people, contribution to strengthening and contributing to humanity. And so with that, again, welcome everyone for being here. And to get us started on our topic on coded racism, I turn it over to Shakura.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So as my dad said, I'm going to echo, I hope that you all are finding yourselves hanging in there and doing as best as you can to be in good spirits, however you find that to be. I am so excited to talk about this topic today because in reviewing the slides, it occurred to me that there's a lot of communication exchange that's happening as we think about coded racism. And so, as you all know, I study communication, so I'm excited to kind of give us a different perspective of that a little bit. So a lot of people today may think that the current focus on law and order that pushes people to believe that protests against police terror are actually funded by some white source to riot, air quotes, and tear down society in a new concept. It's not. In fact, if you go back 52 years, in the midst of over 300 US cities experiencing mass uprisings and protests to the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a low-life politician journeyman named Richard Nixon rose into presidency in 1968 by using the same air quote law and order theme for his campaign. Using the fear white people had that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, Republic of New Africa, etc., would come into their white worlds, rape white women, and steal the sacred white way of life, Nixon won this election easily. It can be effectively argued that this entire country in its current colonial formation was founded and has been maintained on that type of coded racist fear. The entire bias of ensuring security in this country from the colonial times up to the present day has been fueled by fear of indigenous and African people. that we seek to do what white society, has been done to us for hundreds of years. The institutional tactic of racist intimidation is so institutionalized that today it's possible for anyone anywhere to articulate a strong racist position that would influence millions without even mentioning African and indigenous people by name. All that's required is the use of codes, because white people and all of us have been programmed to understand what those codes mean, despite the fact that most white people will never admit this phenomenon. Next slide, please. Thank you. Coded racism reaches a much broader audience. The ratings of the KKK or neo-Nazi groups have always had and will always maintain their appeal. Those views are actually interwoven in coded racist practices, but blunt appeals attacking the humanity of African, indigenous, and other colonized people will never reach the mass audience the capitalist system seeks to maintain mind control over. So coded racism is the secret tool that they use to secure these results. For as many people that you can convince to listen to you by saying that African man is going to try to rape white women, you will get 10 times as many people to support you saying in code that your families are not safe due to the protests. How the message is delivered is different, but after centuries of systemic white supremacy, how the message is received is exactly the same. White people are not safe. And the racist and coded concepts of suggesting that there is such a thing as air quote black on black crime because 91% of Africans are killed by other Africans doesn't explain to those of you who believe that how Africans can occupy the fear of white people when 85% of whites are killed by other whites. So instead of a logical approach to understanding why people are protesting and what is actually happening on the ground at protests, we are left with the fear mongering and the concerted efforts to redirect people's attention away from the fact that this capitalist system has completely destroyed any chance that we have at security by pushing them to believe that their worries are somehow linked and threatened by our desire to assert our dignity as human beings. And just a side note, like everything else that we do in this world, why would the truth be something that we seek? We are socialized to be under the mindset that we should follow things that are not truth and go with things that are lacking integrity, when the fact is, the more that we seek the truth, the more that we understand how backwards the system really is. So like Nixon did 52 years ago, presidential candidates from both parties do the same thing today. Yes, the Democrats are less guilty than the Republicans because they have the integrity that would expose this coded racism for what it is. Instead, they validate it by parroting the same misinformation that equates property damage as equally or more important than our actual lives. By the picture shown on this slide, by the way, the picture shown on this slide is not from any BLM protests or even from any urban rebellion in the 1960s. This picture reflects the evening in San Francisco, California, in the United States, after the San Francisco Giants baseball team won the World Series in October of 2010. Further affirmation that the fear tactic of equating riots, air quotes, with our struggles for justice, which is how most people have been trained to define air quote riot, is absolutely absurd. Additionally, keep in mind that as humans, we communicate through messages, behaviors, nonverbals, facial expressions, symbols, and many other ways. Communication is a transactional process, so consider how socialization can be used as a weapon to promote communicating to oppressed people that they are inferior and criminalized. This of 500 years plus of years is how those messages have been constructed into part of our subconscious and even conscious. So I would challenge us all to consider rejecting and reversing those teachings as we become more aware so that we can continue to deconstruct oppression as we work for a better future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakura. So building on what Shakur talked about, what are the benefits of this tactic, this strategy and tactics of coded racism? What does it produce for those that use it? And so I think that, obviously, like Shakur alluded to, you see a big history of this behind elections in this country, using fear to drive people in a certain position. And I think it's important to state again and again and again that this society, this entire Western Hemisphere actually But if you just use the United Snakes as an example, this society was built on this fear of the indigenous person and this fear of the African. And it's so embedded in this culture that you don't even think about it. It's just automatic. It's remote control automatic. And I'll give you a quick example. I know most people probably see, I'm a big Robert De Niro fan. I think he's an outstanding actor. And I love to watch his movies, and I've watched his movies, multiple times, each one. And one of my favorite ones is Cape Fear, which came out 30 years ago, actually. And it's a remake of a movie that came out in the 50s with Robert Mitchum. But in that movie, if you haven't seen it, I'm sure most of you have, De Niro plays a deranged character who's assaulting Nick Nolte, who was his defense lawyer years before and did not adequately represent him. And so that's the plot of the movie. But in the course of the movie, Nick Nolte hires this private investigator to help protect him and his family against Robert De Niro. And when they're sitting in Nick Nolte's kitchen with his family, Juliette Lewis is the daughter. I can't remember the wife's name in the movie, but he's talking to them, this guy who plays the private investigator, and the movie's based in Georgia. And he says, the history of this country is rooted in fear. He says, fear of the Indian, fear of the slave. And I thought, that like, this is just a popular culture movie, but it's so obvious and it's so irrefutable that, they just have lines like this in the movie, and you watch the movie and it still doesn't calculate to people what that actually means, even though I'm sure most of you, like I said, have seen that movie and heard that line probably multiple times, and other things that adhere and speak to that as well. But it still doesn't really get people to think in terms of the fact that this entire society is based on demonizing and dehumanizing colonized people. And that's really the core of values in this society. That's really what's driving a lot of what happens today. And so if you look at elections, for example, that's why every time there's an election and you have this catering to these racist fears and this code language. Like, it used to be 100 years ago, you could just, if you were running for office, you could just say, I want to keep the ends, I want to keep them under control, and that was okay. And I totally understand that people still say those types of things. Obviously, I understand that. But as an effective strategy, saying those types of things out in the open is Shakur mentioned, is only going to give you a certain level of exposure and support in this society. If you want broader support, you have to use the coded racist approach. You have to say things that mean the same thing but don't sound the same. And that's what happens every time you have an election. That happens. You see it now with, again, the same slogan Nixon used 50 years ago, law and order. And underneath that, it's not a question of, well, we want to make sure that people follow laws and that there's justice. That's not what that means, because if that meant that, then the first people they'd have to arrest and prosecute to the fullest extent of the law would be these Gestapo police that are shooting and killing people at will. So that's not happening. So clearly that's not what they mean. And the vigilantes that do the same thing. So clearly that's not what that means. What they're saying when they say law and order is code language to say that you got to be afraid of these Africans and these indigenous people. Just like you were afraid of them 400 years ago, you got to be afraid of them today. The impending slave revolt is still, the fear is still here. And to protect what you have, you've got to be prepared to engage in war against these people. That's what's being said when they say law and order. That's the message that's being presented. You have to engage in that. And I understand, clearly there are millions of European people, clearly millions of white people who are on the streets protesting for African lives today. Clearly that's happening. But you have to realize that in the mindset of this ideology of white supremacy, when those people make the decision to stand in solidarity with us, they're seen no different than us. That's why they can be shot down. Like you look at what people are saying about this 17-year-old terrorist from Kenosha, Wisconsin, United Snakes, who murdered two people a couple of weeks ago. White people are not expressing any empathy for those two white people that got killed there. They see them the same as us. They stood in solidarity with us. They see them exactly the same as us. So the coded language speaks to it speaks to continuing to advance those values of empire. And a big part of maintaining this capitalist empire is maintaining white supremacy, because that is clearly the main tool that the capitalist system uses to maintain its rule. So yes, it's elections that certainly, speak to how that process is used, but it's also a lot of other things beyond elections. If you look at, like, for example, gentrification or land grab, as I call it, this coded language is used often for that, all the time for that. And I'll give you a quick example to illustrate how coded language connects to white supremacy and gentrification. So years ago, this was 1987. I remember because Shakura, you were just a baby. And ironically, we had just come back from a road trip from Los Angeles, where we had been engaging in all African people's revolutionary work down there. We went down there to do work in the housing projects with our African street organizations, or what you would call Bloods and Crips. And so we had just come back to Sacramento, where I was living then, from doing that. And I picked up at that time, I subscribed to the Sacramento Bee newspaper. So I picked up the copy and I was reading it. And it was sometime in 1987. I'm not sure exactly what month, but you can find it because on the front page of the Sacramento Bee, it had a picture of what was supposed to be an African Blood or Crip person, member. And what the article was about, it was talking about this so-called pipeline that existed up Interstate 5 from Los Angeles through Sacramento, through Portland, Oregon, through Seattle, Washington. And what they were arguing, what they showed is a picture of this guy. And the article said that he was using sign language so that the police who were standing there, he was in a park in Portland, and this guy supposedly is using sign language to communicate to other Bloods and Crips or whoever it was that was supposedly with him, so that the police didn't know what he was communicating to them. And this was in 1987. Now, I read this article, and at that time, I didn't know anything about Portland, Oregon. I didn't know that I would eventually move there and live there for a while. I didn't know anything about it. But as I got older and, got more entrenched in this political education process that we're talking about, and then I moved to Portland, I'm pretty sure that the park that they were talking about, for those that know Portland, Oregon, is Woodlawn Park, which is in Northeast Portland, because I remember the picture and it looks like what I know Woodlawn Park to look like. And then I know the history that there was some of that activity in that park leading up through the 1990s. So I'm pretty sure that was where that was. But the point I want to make about this is that I remember in 1987 reading the article and just cracking up laughing and showing it to your mother, Shakura, at the time. And we were both laughing because sign language to communicate, like, I wish we had that level of organizations in our street organizations and any organizations we have. And so we knew, reading that article then, almost 33 years ago, we knew that, like, this is about something else. And now that I'm much more familiar with land grab, much more familiar with Portland, Oregon, much more familiar with Sacramento, and all these cities where land grab or gentrification takes place, I know that what was happening is that's how the process of land grab takes place. And especially after doing, housing justice work in Portland and getting the on-the-ground concrete details of how it works, I understand what that 1987 article was designed to do. What it was designed to do, and this is what they do in all the neighborhoods, they create this vision of fear. The gangs are taking over the neighborhoods. The gangs are this big threat to everyone's safety, and they're the biggest threat anywhere on earth. And if we don't stop these gangs, then your whole life is going to be overrun and it's going to be taken care of. And this is true regardless of the actual fact that even in the most dense gang areas, you can go to like South LA or East LA or Chicago, Southwest Chicago. In each of those instances, the overwhelming majority of people killed are either people directly connected to, what's going on, the conflict between those organizations, or there are people who are caught in, they're there when these shootings happen. So there are instances of incidental deaths that happen, but that's certainly not the majority. And there's certainly no evidence to suggest that any of these organizations are organized on any level to start taking over territory in white neighborhoods. That has never happened anywhere, ever. It hasn't even been a threat. There hasn't even been an attempt to do anything like that. So that's clearly a scare tactic. And so what happens is when they promote that, then people start to move out of those neighborhoods out of fear, these inner city neighborhoods. And so when people move out of those neighborhoods, or even if they're there, the people who are there, the property values drop. This is a tactic that's used, you all. The property values drop. And then once the property values drop, because anytime you have a neighborhood where there's this threat, the property values are going to go down. And once that happens, then these developers roll in and they can buy up these properties at very low, below market costs. And these developers always have these partnerships with these cities, these development commissions, where they can get all of these tax breaks and all of these incentives to do what they're doing, this flipping houses phenomenon. And then they go and do that, and then they can build properties and sell them and make huge profits. So this is the kind of stuff that this process is built on. And so the point of saying that is, so-called urban renewal, what I've always called African removal. This is, flipping houses, doing this whole process. Some of you on here probably consider yourself, I'm gonna try to flip some houses. This is a respectable and respected form of doing business, even though it's based and rooted in this concept of white supremacy that I've just described to you. This coded language that criminalizes and dehumanizes African and indigenous people so that these neighborhoods, they can be systematically driven out of these neighborhoods, and nobody really cares because these people aren't human, and anything that happens to them is justified. And if you understand that, then you understand why that's the mentality today. Anything that happens to us is justified. Some of you know people who believe that. Some of your family members believe that because of this dehumanization process, which has been institutionalized through this code language, because these folks really believe that there's a threat against them that really in reality does not exist. So let's talk about, coded racism as policy. And then here you have a picture of this woman that was used in political campaigns quite a bit in the 70s and 80s. And this woman is supposed to represent the epitome of the welfare queen, someone who receives government checks, never works a day in her life, fraudulently receives these checks, and lives this lavish lifestyle off of making all this money from, defrauding the welfare system. And yeah, like anything else, I mean, there's some exceptions to this, just like there's some exceptions to, there's this controversy about people who choose to voting by mail. Sure, there's some exceptions where people have been able, but these are negligible, meaning they're minuscule compared to the overall process. They're minuscule how many people can defraud the welfare system and live lavish lifestyle. These are one or two off choices. The majority of people who are on those systems need that aid to survive, and even getting it honestly and looking for work and doing everything they're supposed to do still don't have nearly enough to properly support a family. So this is, but this is still not that, what I just said is not the common belief that people have. The common belief is that, well, the majority of people on there are just frauds. And so that's another form of coded language. Like, these folks are just trying to get something for nothing. That's what that's speaking to, is this image you see here, this fraudulent image that this is what everybody who is on aid is doing. So, these are what's going on. And then, you can talk about, like, here where I live in Sacramento, they initiated a policy in West Sacramento years ago where they had a no gang tolerance ordinance. And since that time, a lot of cities have implemented this policy. And so what this is essentially boils down to is the police have a ability to, if there's two or more people congregated, to consider that a gang meeting and to break it up and to investigate a crime. And if you understand policing, you know that when the police have justification to investigate a crime, whatever supposed rights you're supposed to have, all of that goes out the window, because now they have the right to demand identification from you. And if you don't have it, they have the right to assume that you're up to no good. They have a right to make all these assumptions about you that that can lead to down all sorts of rabbit holes about what they can do for you, to you. And on top of all that, before we even get to all that, what this does is gives them the arbitrary right to decide that, if there's two old white women on the corner, they're not going to look at them and say, well, that's a gang gathering. But if there's two indigenous people there, no matter what their gender, or two African people there, no matter what their gender, even two poor white people there, no matter what their gender, more often than not, they're going to approach that with this kind of mentality that they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. They could just be talking about the 49er game, which most often that's what it is, but it doesn't matter. This is how this coded practice of white supremacy can implement itself and pose real problems for our lives. And if you look at the anti-immigration fervor, which is dominant in this society right now, this is without question a severely concrete example, a very good, rather concrete example of how coded racism works. And I use this example all the time. Like, all you have to do is go back 150 years to when chattel slavery ended in this country, 1863, 1865, right? And what happened when that happened? The white plantation owners in the South, they told their white working class workers, hey, we can't pay you anything because now we got to pay these people. We don't have slavery anymore. We got to pay them now to work. Can't just exploit their labor for free. We can exploit it through low wages now, but we don't have any way to pay you. And it's not like white workers responded to that by saying, yeah, we don't believe it. We want to see the books. We want to see the financial statements. That's not what happened. Instead, what happened is the Ku Klux Klan was created. And so if you fast forward 150 years to today, what's the talking point today? It's this coded white supremacy. Well, you can't have jobs because immigrants are stealing your jobs. Immigrants are stealing your jobs. And what are white workers doing today? Are they saying, no, we want to see the financial statements? No, they're buying this like they bought it over the last 150 years, hook, line, and sinker. And I remember when I was working, I worked for a labor union, SEIU, and when I was working there in Oregon, I was talking to these guys that if you've ever driven up through Oregon, if you drive through Portland to the state of Washington, you cross over the Columbia River. Well, I was on the bridge. There's a bridge there over the river. I was on top of the bridge meeting with these guys who are the highway, they're guys that lift the bridge. And I did a presentation on income inequality to them. There were 6 of these guys. They were all, this is before Trump, but they were all Tea Party guys, And so I gave this presentation on income inequality. And I asked them, so what do you all think? And the one guy said, well, it's because of the Mexicans. And I said, well, how have Mexican people created income equality for you? Because he was saying that, he's a victim of income inequality. I said, so how are Mexican people? Well, they're taking all the jobs. My son applied for a job at a winery and he couldn't get hired. And I said, okay, well, what winery? Because I don't drink alcohol, but I have many friends who do. And, they like to have me come along because I'm they got a guaranteed, reliable, designated driver. And I like to go because watching people get drunk is sometimes funny. So I'll go, and we're friends and we have a relationship, so I'll go sometimes. And so I've never seen a winery that didn't have a help wanted sign up. because obviously I work in this field, so I pay attention to that sort of thing. I've never seen that. And so I asked this guy, well, what winery was it? Because I, had gone to many of the wineries around that area, just like I've gone to them here in Napa. And I'm like, well, which one was it? And then as soon as I said that, his friend sitting next to him said, your lazy ASS son ain't look for no job. And so then we started having this long conversation about the son and the methamphetamines and his deteriorated relationship with his son. And I'm like, dude, why couldn't we just have said this at first? Like that, why do the Mexican people have to be scapegoats because you have a dysfunctional relationship with your son? But that's how this coded white supremacy works. That's the point of the story, is that it's so much easier to blame people who don't have that voice to stand up on the same level of platform and speak for themselves. It's easy to blame them. There's no consequences to blaming them. So this is the cowardly way in which people decide to carry out their lives, by engaging in this cowardly behavior and accepting this coded racism, instead of just being able to have the courage and integrity to say, this is not right. Clearly, these people are not responsible for anything bad happening in my life. And so this is how this continues to go, because it's just something that's easier for folks to do. And you can look at all the things happening today and see this. And I just want to give you another quick example to illustrate. And this is what I mentioned earlier about wanting to talk about the indigenous people. So, I read this book, and it talked about during the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in this country, he was president for 12 years. He was actually the last president that didn't have a term limit. And after that, they imposed the 8-year rule. You couldn't be president longer than 8 years, but he was president 12 years from 1933 until 45, right? And during his administration, he passed this law that was a law designed around rights of property. I can't remember the word right now, but rights of property. And what he did is the federal government here created 92 communities that were based on these settlement laws that were passed. And in these 92 communities, what they did is they gave thousands of families free land, free houses, chicken coops free, agricultural resources and equipment free. All of this was free. And this was in response to the Great Depression, to try to, kickstart the economy by giving people the opportunity to, engage in self-determinative work so that they can make contributions to the economy as a way of kickstarting it. So this is what happened. And of course, all of these established government-funded and established communities, it was illegal for African people or indigenous people to have access to all this free stuff. It was just white people that got it. And so the book I was reading motivated me to do research on what's happening with these communities today. And so what I did is I found one of those communities. I found a number of them, but one of them I wanted to talk to you about is Novelt, Pennsylvania. It's a community of about 892 people, very small community. But again, understand that the hundreds of houses there were given to those families by the government several decades ago. The land was given to them by the government. The resources they have to grow food and do everything they do on the land was provided to them free of charge by the government. All white people in this town, still to this day. And what was happening in the article is these people were being interviewed. They're all, fervent. I don't think there's anybody in town that does not support Donald Trump for president, based on them talking to the people and the history of how they voted in 2016 and everything. And they were interviewing these people, and there's this 91-year-old piece of garbage person who's talking about how the reason why they support him is that they feel like people should have to work for what they get. They shouldn't have to get anything free. And journalism is at an all-time low in this capitalist system. So the person who was interviewing this person on video, like, they didn't even have the courage to ask them, well, What about the fact that the house you're sitting in was given to your family? They didn't even ask them that simple question. They didn't ask them anything. So this is the mentality, the arrogant mentality that exists in this society. You can sit up in a house provided to you by the government, provided to your family, probably her because she was 1,000 years old, and you can sit there and create this false narrative of what other people are getting free when you clearly are the person who got something free in a system that denied that same opportunity to the rest of us here. And there's no hesitation to challenge that, or there's no challenge to that, I should say. And it should also be noted that there are land settlement policies. Like every state in this country had some sort of policy like that happened. In California, it was the California Land Resettlement Plan. In Oregon, it was the Oregon Land Donation Program. And so the way these programs worked is the same way that this program worked during the Roosevelt administration, where all this was given to Europeans. It wasn't permitted to be given to anyone else. And just another example of that is when I lived in Oregon, and I lived in Bend, Oregon. Bend has the Deschutes River goes through it. It's very nice. On a sunny day, you can sit out there and, at the restaurants or on the river, and you can sit out there. And I did a lot of writing out there. And I've told this story before, I believe several weeks ago, but there was an older white gentleman, and he explained to me, we got in a conversation, and he explained to me that he had never worked a day in his life, and he had an office building he owned on the Deschutes there, and he charged these law firms and CPA firms thousands of dollars a month in rent, and the building was paid for in the 80s, so he's basically makes like $20,000 a month, free and clear, and he just travels around the world and celebrates his life. But he's the one that he hipped me. He told me my grandmother got this land through the Oregon Land Donation Program. And what the program did is lands were forcibly seized from indigenous people, forcibly, violently seized from indigenous people. And then if you were white, you could file a claim on that land once the indigenous people were murdered or displaced from it, both. And then you waited 72 business hours. And if there was no legal reason why you couldn't get it, whatever that would have been, then the land was yours. You didn't have to pay, you just had to pay a small processing fee. And that was it. Because the purpose of the land was a public policy program. It wasn't to make a profit. It was to move, the purpose of the land was to settle European people there to ensure European dominance in the society, and to move indigenous people off and to keep African people out. That was the purpose. Just like the settlements in occupied Palestine were designed to overrun the Palestinian people. That was the same policy that was utilized here. And the code has been utilized to cover up the brutality of the policy, so that today people actually believe, sitting in a house that was given to your family by the government through violence, murder, and terror against indigenous people, and you actually can sit on that property and be so arrogantly stupid that you can question people getting something and not working for it. And that's what this coded policy of white supremacy has done. It's created this cover where these types of rabid contradictions can exist and people have no clue. So another example is, forcibly sterilizing African women and indigenous women, which has been a practice that has gone on for millions of women. And if you don't know about that, what it is that when African indigenous women go to the hospital for any type of surgical procedure, without being asked, without consent given, the hospitals just systemically sterilize them so they can't have any more children. And this is an interesting thing, because this has been policy that's impacted millions of women. There's so many, you can just look it up. There's so many class action lawsuits because this is still something that happens. But yet white supremacists can come out boldly to Black Lives Matter events today, which they do, and talk about how more African children are killed by abortion than by police, when the number of people who have abortions doesn't even compare to the number of these women who have been forcibly sterilized. So, again, this is an example of this type of coded approach to white supremacy that's used instead of, just out and out, coming out and saying it. That's why I know some of you don't understand it, but that's why some of us, like, we prefer the Klan. We prefer the neo-Nazis. We know exactly where they're coming from. That's much better than this coded thing of, well, we're just concerned about your children and abortions. So we decide to come out to when you're exerting your dignity against police killings to talk about abortion, but we're doing it because we're really concerned about you. We prefer just someone to come straight out and say we should be annihilated to that kind of hypocrisy that exists here. And it's all because of this code that's been allowed to function and exist to the level that exists today. So how do we eliminate this? Like, what do we do about this? How do we stop this from how it's so institutionalized? Like, what are some of the things that we need to do? And of course, it's always important that we remember that, coded white supremacy is simply a symptom of the problem. It's not the problem. It's simply a symptom of the problem. And the problem is this capitalist system. The problem is this system which was built on white supremacy and is maintained on white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia and all these forms of oppression. So we can't eliminate racism without eliminating the system that produces racism. You can't do that. You can't eliminate racism without talking about capitalism. And so many of you want to talk about racism without talking about the need for capitalism to be eradicated. And it's really a disservice because all it does is add more. There's already all this confusion from coded white supremacy. And then we have this added confusion of people who really, I guess, want to try to find some way to preserve the capitalist system, but thinking you can eliminate racism by doing it. And I'm talking to all of us that do that. Even those of us that say, well, buying black is the solution. That is not going to address the systemic contradiction about it. Like, we have to talk about this system. And the problem I have, even with my own people who, economics that they have is what's provided to them by multinational corporations. And I will never have anybody be able to convince me that that model is going to free and liberate anybody. All that's going to do is put money in your pocket if you're successful at doing it. It's not going to do anything else. And I used to have a friend years ago that he would come to our party events. He would come every time, very intelligent brother. And he would say afterwards, we go to eat or whatever afterwards, and he would say, everything y'all are saying is right, but I'm trying to get paid. And we used to go back and forth, but I had so much respect for him because at least he was honest. Like, he wasn't ever trying to pretend like, well, I'm going to do this because it's going to liberate our people. He was like, no, I'm just trying to get some money. I'm trying to get paid. I'm trying to get something for myself. And so at least be honest, because that's what that is. Because any talk about eliminating white supremacy without talking about capitalism is really trying to accomplish something else other than eradicating white supremacy. Because there's no way that you can eliminate the tree and not eliminate the roots. The tree will just grow again. And then also, this is related to this acceptance of this incremental change, and that we have to, what we have to do is this lesser of two evils approach, and yeah, I mean, again, saying this again, nobody is saying that if you believe that you got to do something with the Democratic Party that you shouldn't do that. You've never heard us tell you that you shouldn't do it. But what you should have heard us say is that we don't understand why you continue to base all of your energy and efforts into that one element of the system, just voting, nothing else behind it, no movement to push the system, nothing, just voting. And we don't have anything to show for that strategy, but yet so many people keep acting like that's the only thing that we should do. And if you're not willing to do that, that you're somehow contrary to justice. when the reason why people aren't doing it is because they don't see where it has developed any real tangible changes to the problems that exist in this society. And you're doing nothing to show them why they should see it any different. So this is a problem, because what ends up happening is that those of you that do that, you become gatekeepers for the capitalist system. Well, all you can do is play by the enemy's rules. And if you do anything else, then you're the problem. You're what we got to talk about. And instead of doing that, all we're saying is, why don't you build some kind of movement? You won't even support like the Poor People's Campaign and campaigns out here that are trying to do that. You won't even support that. You know, those are your politics, not mine. And you won't even support that. So, you know, you got to do at least that. And at least if we can begin to do that type of work on a mass level, then we can begin to build the type of consciousness that can really, truly begin to address these problems, because that's what it's going to take to do that. Even with spontaneous, last minute, spur of the moment marches and demonstrations, look at the level of consciousness that's been achieved over the last several months. I hear everywhere now this term institutional racism. I hear it everywhere. Never used to hear it anywhere. So that's a progress that we can at least have that term be discussed. Even this debate about defunding police, even though it's the gatekeepers have taken over the argument, really where that came from is those of us who want to abolish police, eliminate police. Socialism leading to communism is about eliminating state apparatuses that are oppressive to the people, like police. But though that's been co-opted to mean, we want to take money from police and give it to, but even that's still good, because it's a discussion about the role of police in society. So it's still progress, no matter how you slice it, no matter how much they take over the discussion. So even with disorganized, spontaneous, spur of the moment action, we're still been able to elevate the discussion in many areas. Those are just two examples. Imagine what we could do if we were organized and had the capacity to build extended resources around these questions. Imagine how much progress we can make. So that's what, the message that we are consistently trying to get people. There's no easy way. You can't just pull a lever and think you're doing something to advance society when your enemy controls all the mechanisms and you pulling the lever. That we got to do more than that. You can do that if that's what you want to do, but we got to do more than that. That cannot be all that we do. That's insanity. That's the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. That's the definition of insanity. Every election is this is an important election. There's never been one that wasn't the important one. They all are important, and they, we all did. The same thing happens every time, and the same result happens every time. It's because most of us are not doing anything different than that. And for some odd reason, we refuse to see that and acknowledge that obviously this approach is not working. So that has to change. And so just to close out, as always, we come back to what we started with. If you joined late, we talked about it. I talked about, in our political education process, 4 different books that I've had to read this week for different organizational segments of our All African People's Revolutionary Party. 4 different books in a week, and this is how we do it, you all. You don't have to do all of that. I mean, all we ask, like for new people in our organization, like I'm helping facilitate one of our newer circles here in Northern California with a bunch of people. And, we ask them to read 5 pages a day, 7 pages, 70 pages every 2 weeks, because the meetings are every 2 weeks. I mean, that's just, and it's not just you reading individually, but sitting down with others and engaging in educational material. Like I had a discussion early this morning. I mentioned our International Political Education Committee meeting, and we had people from all over the world. We talked about the Cultural Revolution in China and the impacts of it on women. And we had a spirited debate. And if you do this consistently, your ability to understand what's going on in the world grows extensively. Your ability to articulate what's going on in the world grows extensively. The ability of the capitalist system to confuse you reduces extensively. And imagine if we had on a mass level millions of people who were experiencing this growth, then it would be much easier for us to progress. But as long as we have, you're watching CNN and you might read one article that's, 30% right and 70% wrong, and that's it, then we're going to continue to have this reality where the capitalist system is providing you with your political education. Even though you think that you're getting it on your own, the capitalist system is providing it to you. And I gave you the example earlier, people wearing "I'm not my grandmother" on their t-shirts. That's the capitalist system providing you your education, because what it's told you is that your people didn't stand up and have agency to defend themselves. And you believe that. You haven't even taken the time to know how to investigate that yourself and learn about the Maroon rebellions, learn about Carlotta in Cuba, who led a slave revolt of thousands of people, learn about Nanny and the Maroons, who led slave revolts, Asantewaa, who led slave revolts of thousands of people, millions of people in the Congo region and central coast of Africa who led rebellions and defeated the Europeans time and time again and prevented them from taking even more people out of Africa. All of these slave rebellions that we engaged in, where millions of lives were saved. You don't know anything about that. And because you can't know, because if you did, you wouldn't wear a shirt like that. And even those of us here who engaged in this struggle and ran, pulled up guns, you don't know about the Deacons for Defense and how the Ku Klux Klan showed up in 1965 in Alabama and the Deacons shot the Klansmen in the face. You don't know anything about that. You didn't know anything about that before I just said it, because we don't have systemic political education. You don't know anything about how the Deacons, armed to the teeth, would give a press conference before every civil rights march, and they would say, if these Klansmen, these white supremacists come out here, if they fire one shot, they better have good life insurance. And how many lives they saved by doing that. You know anything about the African Blood Brotherhood here in this country that organized arms, the Republic of New Africa, who sent hundreds of people into Mississippi armed with the objective of taking the state over in 1973. You don't know anything about that because we have no organized political education, you all. So when the enemy says, well, all y'all did was get the you-know-what slapped out of you and you just saying we shall overcome, then you believe that because you don't know any better. So this is the reason why political education is important. Because any of these people try to slap me, they're going to be having a miserable rest of the day because I know my history. And I know that we have always stood up for our dignity. And nobody's going to convince me different. And nobody's going to convince my child who's on here any different because she knows our history. So this is why we constantly harp on this, you all. It's not enough for you to just do something as an individual. That's great, but it doesn't help us solve the problem. It only hopefully helps you individually, but it doesn't help us solve the problem. And as long as the problem is not solved collectively, you cannot solve it individually. All you can do is just try to, maintain something, tread water. And I don't know, maybe for some of us that's enough, but for most of us, it's not. We want to solve the problem. So you got to be in an organization. You got to be in a political organization that has political education as a core component and community defense. You can do all the rest. You can do self-defense training. You can do arms training. We do all that. We don't have to talk about it because it's not about talking about it. It's about preparing. But you got to do that based on political education. And if we don't do that, then, all we're doing is just pretending, doing performative art. That's all it is. And some of us, performance is no longer enough. We want real action and we want change. So we ask you to join organizations, join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Please do that. Join other organizations working for justice. And if you don't have political education if you have it, engage it seriously. If you don't have it, get it. And if you're not African, let us help you develop political education. We'll share our templates with you. We'll help you do that because we know that the more of us who do this, the stronger we'll get. And you have your resources here shown on the screen. That's more political education. There are articles, there's everything there designed to educate you from the revolutionary Pan-African perspective, what's going on in the world. And so we encourage you to, follow and support these independent means. And Shakura, is there anything you wanted to add before we close?
I know we're at time. Bobby, Glenn, and I have had some incredible information resource exchanging on the chat. And I just
Excellent.
wanted to quickly add, we talked a lot about racism being coded in a lot of social and environmental situations, but I just want to also add, for those that work in healthcare and things like that, there's actually a lot of research out now about how racism is coded specifically with dealing with African women and indigenous women when they're going to have prenatal care appointments or anything like that with OBGYNs. And so I just want to make sure if we are in that practice where we're working with patients, we just need to be mindful and not just quickly code her as quote unquote being non-compliant, when really at the end of the day, if she doesn't have transportation or if she doesn't have income because she's literally working 3 jobs to keep her lights on, it's not really fair for us to just make all these assumptions about her and her health when we're not considering all the barriers that she has to face on a day-to-day basis. And again, coded racism is in healthcare just as much as it is in anything else. And it's our responsibility to be objective about that and to service these people because they deserve a better humanity. Thank you.
That is correct, Mundo. And on that note, that wonderful note, we'll close out. We want to thank you all for joining us again. We appreciate you coming. People continue to do it. We'll have another topic out for next Sunday. And be safe out here. There's so many challenges against humanity. Be the best human you can be. Continue to do that because that's how we'll win. And we have to do it together. We can't do it individually. We have to do it together. So let's organize, and we can win. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Forward ever, backwards never.